All right, one of the important things I want to talk about this week is using a grid in InDesign. So I didn't open in this case an existing brand guide. I want to actually use my thesis so I can talk more about how I worked with it. To start with, well, first of all, ignore the crappy photo. We had to submit to the school an actual PDF of our our thesis books, and so my book was a physical book that I made, so the PDF wasn't always the best. But to start with, I'm going to look at the master page and the grid I set up, and then give you an idea. So I like a modular grid, which I think I said in the setup document. And in this case, I use a lot more columns than you probably want to, but maybe this will inspire you and you'll be interested in it. The goal with the grid is just to give you a framework to know how to place things, to kind of give everything homes. The other thing that's on this page is the line and the page number piece, but we're focusing mostly on the grid. So I'm going to come out here to the pages, and I'm going to go past the cover page, because the cover, obviously, it was a physical, like, we can see it was a bound book using a post and screw binding. I printed on fabric, which was woven through this wood cover that was cut, but that all doesn't really apply to what you're working on in the assignment. So to start with, I use the grid in different ways for different pages, and we'll notice this one, the grid is actually not, there's not an A master applied, so some were with the none and some were with the actual grid. So sometimes it's appropriate to have multiple types of grid pages, but the consistency was every page like this had a line like that ran down it, and then it had text here that it aligned to the bottom of the page. Moving on, so similar here again, every quote page or that title page had that. Here's where we start to see the modular, and I'm using this to have sort of a space for this thank you. Here again, and sometimes your column, like if I'm treating this like a column, it may not perfectly align with this like this one did, but I should try to, as much as possible, do that. In this case, again, it was treated more like a column. We actually get our thesis book signed, so I'll in a different video talk about how to get these lines in, because this line is actually part of the text. It's not a separate piece. Moving on, so table of contents, again, it's aligned to the particular, it's treating this like a column, so it didn't quite line up here, but this line is lined up, this is sort of contained within this. So it's thinking about too, like I don't use each one of these tiny little spaces as a column. In most cases I used, five of these as one column, and on the larger blocks was pretty consistent. This actually should be up here. I've been into it a couple times, so I think some things got misaligned. But yeah, so same thing here. Again, this goes back to sort of the single grid. Not everything was using the full grid. This just, it used the columns, but in a little different way. And then we get to the actual text. So again, the start is 5 columns. This was consistent. So we did what was on the table of contents page pretty consistently. It aligned in the same spot. And then with the copy though, these were smaller, these were 4. So pay attention to the fact, like the nice part about a modular grid or having more columns here is you have more flexibility to work with stuff. I do always keep, so when you're laying out an InDesign file, I do keep the copy within these pink and purple margin lines. I believe I talked about the black lines are the edge of the page, and then I have pink and purple that are margins, and then the main copy goes inside the margins. I also have a really wide gutter on the inside of the page, or a wide margin here, because if we saw with the metal bracket, it went in very far, and I don't want content to get cut off. So you guys, like most of your items would just be staple bound, or what's called saddle stitching. They used to actually physically stitch it, now they use staples. you don't really need a huge gutter. A half an inch is probably sufficient. But if you like the look of a larger gutter, so a visual preference, you can do that. But yeah, so then this consistently, like, there was the consistent step throughout the document. So as I go into section 1, and here, one interesting thing that we haven't talked about in InDesign, and we can see it better here, you can have custom page sizes. You don't need to have everything that's an 8.5 by 11. So that's something to know. So again, another section, we have the same start, didn't go quite as long, paying attention to paragraph breaks. And so these pages kind of mirror each other. They minimize that so we can see. So the outside columns are always up higher, the inside are always lower. We're using the overall grid and trying to break, or depending on spacing, it might be a little different. I did mix fonts, so there are some different fonts in here, but I'm consistently using the grid. And then even when I do pictures, you notice I'm working with the grid there. In this case, under the picture, the text is just sort of an even line to match the picture instead of staggering. Here, like with all these pictures, using the grid as much as possible. Sometimes, like, considering this as one, there are times where you have to break the grid to make it fit. But as much as possible, I tried to be consistent. I also tried to have the consistent gutter, even if I broke the grid a little bit. But it's important to really pay attention and think about that. So again, consistency. Here we do this. Again, same layout. In this case, this is one of those specially sized. In the actual book, there's a thin fold-out piece. This is why I constructed it myself. Here's the other side of the thin pull-out piece. Going, again, another image use, similar treatment. So there's this challenge to be consistent, but also have the ability, like, there's different images that go here, so that's going to work a little differently. So paying attention to how you can be consistent and how you can be different. And even here, you'll notice the grid is still in place. It's just a lot smaller. Again, another pull-out. This one was longer. It had multiple sections. But really being consistent. More text. Another pull-out with other images. And then here, because I had 2 images I needed to use, I kind of replicated somewhat of the stagger, but I had to work with the grid and then the image itself size. I don't want to stretch images when I'm laying it out, but it's figuring out how to be consistent and when you can break it, because you have to. Like here, when there were 2 lines, it goes above and hits the top of the gutter here when it normally shouldn't. Normally you want to stay, unless you're bleeding across the gutter, you want to stay on the inside of the gutter and not go across it. Again, occasionally there are reasons not to. Another special size pullout. So InDesign really is meant for this book function. I didn't just pick InDesign because I enjoy torturing people. I picked InDesign because it makes the most sense for this type of publication. Illustrator is just not equipped to do this. So again, here working with the images, I always leave this column empty because otherwise it gets too close to this. But in this case, I actually bled across here a little bit to make room for everything. And here, we didn't have the image go the full way. We just put the the captions next to it. Another pullout. So this is just giving you hopefully a general idea of how to work with a grid. It's a skill I think we don't enforce enough with students, but it's an important skill. It's, I think, a crucial skill if you're going to do a publication. So you notice even when I get to like bibliography, we're being consistent. And then my image list still being consistent. In this case, it broke a little bit because of what content I had. It had to start on this side. But mostly it's consistent across the board. I would also note that the page numbers, because I notice a lot of people in the flat plan, the left side is always even, the right side is always odd, because we always start, if we look in my document here, even with facing pages, you always start with one that's like when the book's closed, then you open, You see the other side of the cover, the first page, and then the last page is always single 2 because it's once you've closed the book. So your page numbers, if you look where mine start, I don't think it starts here. So I didn't start my page numbers until here. So even though this page is 1 by default, and you could set this page, for example, in your documents, maybe you want this to be 1. Normally though, page numbers will still, like, this is 9, which is actually 9 in the document. So I'm still leaving this as 1. It depends on your preference. A lot of people would have actually started page 1 here. And you can actually set where you want page number. So if you come here, you can actually come numbering and section options, and so you could have start section, and then you could actually tell it to start at number 1, so it ignores this page. And then now this, I'm just gonna stay okay. So now this page says 7 instead of 9. And this one, yeah. So now the number is more accurate. So we have 1, 2, and then it starts again 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's something, those of you who, if it bothers you that this page would start as 3, then go ahead and change the page numbers like this so that it matches correctly. But that's basically how we work with a grid, as well as just a note on the page numbers since we're already here.